friends. I'm Amy Morgan, the feature writer for the Marriage Initiative, and I am delighted today to introduce you to Harry Benson. You'll recognize Harry's not from the United States as soon as he starts to speak. Harry's the research director for the UK's Marriage Foundation, an organization he joined in 2012 when it was formed by Sir Paul Coleridge, who spent 14 years as High Court judge in the family court. Harry pours through statistics to discover trends and serves as spokesperson as Marriage Foundation champions marriage in the media. He and his wife of 38 years, Kate, wrote What Mums Want and Dads Need to Know, which reached number 11 on Amazon UK. Formerly one of the youngest Royal Navy helicopter pilots to serve in the Falklands War, Harry founded Bristol Community Family Trust, where he led thousands of premarital couples through an adaptation of America's Prep Course and developed and taught Let's Stick Together, a pioneering program for new parents delivered through NHS postnatal clinics. He also co-authored influential family policy papers for the Center for Social Justice. Harry will soon complete a PhD in social policy from the School for Policy Studies at Bristol University. Harry, thank you so much for being here.
That's a pleasure. I barely recognize myself. But now you know I'm not American, I'm afraid.
No, that's great. We Americans love hearing the British accent, so you can talk to me all day.
Well, it depends who has the accent.
That's true.
Okay.
Oh, well, in your role at Marriage Foundation, you analyze trends relating to marriage and family. Can you tell us some of the things that you're working on now, what you found?
I suppose the biggest thing, the thing that's dominating my whole life at the moment, is wrapping up my PhD. It's taken me a long time to get round to this thing. I've been in the researching marriage for 25 years, I suppose, since moving out of I was originally a helicopter pilot, and then I went into finance. And maybe we can talk a little bit about background at some stage. But when I came into it, I did a psychology degree in the late 1990s. I was already an old student then when I went and did that as my bachelor's. And then I set up a charity in Bristol, which is a medium-sized city in the west of England, to teach relationship programs across the life cycle to try and help people make the most of what they already had. And then I switched to Marriage Foundation with this High Court judge called Sir Paul Coleridge. We were both on a BBC documentary program, and we didn't know of each other until we spotted each other on the program, and he liked me and I liked him, and we got together and we started this thing called Marriage Foundation. We're essentially a flag bearer for marriage in the UK because no one else does, unbelievably. And I finally got around to, having written lots of research papers, I finally got around to doing my PhD, and I've very, very nearly finished it at the moment. And the big finding essentially is that deciding to marry stacks the odds massively in your favor. That's it. I mean, it's not a lot more complicated than that. Deciding to get married changes the psychology of your relationship that gives you the best possible chance of having the outcome that you want, which is a healthy, happy, long-term, stable relationship, which is best for you and best for your kids. I think it's pretty much as simple as that.
So that seems like that's such common sense, especially to us oldsters, but why is this so revelatory?
I think it's revelatory because we have, the last 50, 60 years, really, and this applies as much to the States as it does to us in Western Europe, the game changed when the contraceptive pill came into play. Up until that point, if you had a baby, pretty much everybody was married. And in the UK, we've got fantastic data going back for hundreds of years on this. And I suspect the same would be true on America if your history was quite as long as ours, but that's another subject. But I suspect the data is pretty similar. I mean, we're culturally quite similar in family terms. And up until the 1960s, the norm was that you got together, you built your relationship, and you then realized that you could make a future together, and you then got married. And at that point, you started living with one another, and you had children, and there was an order to things.
Yes.
And that really changed with birth control. It completely liberated women, particularly, from the need to be worried about getting pregnant and having children, which is obviously a major issue. But that then allowed the whole world of cohabiting to become a thing. And that's what we now have. But it also, the downside of it is that it's liberated men from the need to commit.
Yeah.
And the process of marriage had that all automatically built in. So when you get married, you both make a decision, you make a plan, you send massive signal to one another about your intent. You're really clearly on the same page. You remove any kind of lingering ambiguity that there might be in your relationship. And you then go and stand up and embarrass yourself in front of your friends and family by doing this thing called marriage or wedding. And everyone pats you on the head and says, well done, great choice. And that gives you more of a confidence that this incredibly risky choice you've made is going to work. And I think we've forgotten a lot of these basic principles. And we've seen in across Western Europe and in the States, we see this big trend away from marriage towards cohabiting. And the consequence essentially is that more couples are forming fragile relationships, which arguably would never have got going had they not cohabited and got stuck and then drifted on into marriage and parenting. We wouldn't have seen anything like the levels of family breakdown that we've got today. And in the UK, and I suspect this is true in the States as well, but in the UK, certainly, we've got record levels of family breakdown. If you walk into a classroom with 14, 15-year-old teenagers, typically you should find that 45% of them are not living with both natural parents. That's pretty stunning. And we're not talking about it. Nobody's talking about this. It's not on the political agenda. We've just had an election in the UK. Nobody talks about this at all. And I think it's really shocking. It's an elephant in the room. And the reason why it's got so bad is because of this trend away from marriage. We've forgotten the basic psychology of how couples make things work, how you stick at things, how you make a relationship work. That's essentially it. That's the basic story, I think. Deciding to marry makes a difference. It changes the way you think, and it stacks the odds in your favor of getting the reliable love that you want.
Well, we've had one of your friends and colleagues, Brad Wilcox, just has
Yeah,
been beating that same drum in America
absolutely.
with get married, and I know you guys are friends, but I know we were talking a little bit when you mentioned that about the 15-year-olds that 45% of them would not even be living with both natural parents. What does getting married do to make it more protective? I know you kind
Mm,
of mentioned it, and can you drill down a little bit about
sure.
why being married is more fortuitous for a family?
I think there are two things that you do when you get married. One is that you make a proposal. So you say, will you spend the rest of your life with me? Yes. And obviously you can do that in whatever formula you want. We've just seen a bunch of athletes doing that at the Olympics, amazingly enough.
Yeah, the big
and,
bang
and
picture.
and then there's the secondary thing is then that you celebrate that and announce it and do it in public in front of your friends and family. And so in terms of that you've got this private proposal where you essentially put yourself on the same page and make your plan for the future and make a clear decision as well. Deciding to do things is really important. It really changes the way that you behave and think about things. And it means you more likely to see the best in somebody. And there's lots of psychology behind this thing about making decisions. So one of the classic things, there's a wonderful department in the US at the University of Denver, who are really my gurus, who Scott Stanley, Galena Rhodes, Howard Markman, who are fantastic on this subject of commitment. And they talk about an idea called sliding or deciding. You can either slide or decide through relationship transitions. And deciding is something that we've kind of forgotten. In other areas of life, we know that when we make decisions about things, it really changes the way we think about them. So let me give you an example, which may or may not work for you. But if you were to go to the horse race track and bet on a horse, for example, when you're thinking about betting on that horse, you might feel, I think this horse has got a chance of winning. But when you actually hand over the money and you make the bet, you've decided and you've made an action that follows it. So there's some kind of something obvious that's happened. There's lots of research that says that people become more confident that that horse is going to win.
Yeah.
Now, and the same as if you in other forms of gambling, and the same of other forms of things, any kind of risky endeavor, when you make a decision to do something and follow it up with an action, you tend to see the best in the thing that you've chosen. And it's the opposite of what used to be called cognitive dissonance theory. It's called cognitive consistency theory, where you want your actions to be consistent with your decisions and your attitudes. You want them all to be, you want everything to be lined up. You want to save here's another example. You want to save the planet, but you don't like throwing stuff away. And so you've got to reconcile those two things. And so we are always striving for some kind of consistency. When we make decisions, we become we want consistency to happen. So if I've chosen this particular person to marry, then everything in my identity and my attitudes will change towards making that a good choice. Yeah. And then, of course, you've got the wedding where you stand up and say this in public. The most nerve-wracking day of my whole life, undoubtedly, was my wedding morning, for sure. And bearing in mind, go back in history, I was this young naval helicopter pilot in the Falklands War. And I've come under heavy artillery fire. I've been shot at. I know what it's like to experience all this combat stuff. It was nothing compared to the morning of my wedding day when I was so nervous. But of course, so that was me facing up to the worry of this risky choice that I'm making to choose. My wife's called Kate, and reject all the other choices. But as soon as I saw my family and friends, when I got to the ceremony, boom, I knew that they gave me confidence. Yeah, Harry, you've made a fantastic choice. So that's really what's going on when we get married, is we're putting ourselves on the same page. We're removing any kind of ambiguity, any doubts about our relationship. We're saying this is the plan. We all know that couples divorce, human beings are fallible, so stuff doesn't always work out. But broadly speaking, if you want to make something happen, you want to be really clear that you're on the same page. And that's what the proposal does. And then it's backed up by this standing up and embarrassing yourself. So there's fantastic psychology behind this act of marriage. And this is kind of the thing that we've forgotten. We said, oh, well, if you live together and if you have a baby, that's enough. It isn't, because you can just you can slide into living together and you can slide into having a baby. Yeah. And so it's deciding is really, really important, and then backing that up with this social affirmation.
Well, and a lot of what we've just been talking about, it is found in your book, The Commit or Quit, that you wrote recently. That's one of your more recent books. And you talk about that. And you also talk about kind of a deadline, because as you went back to talking about allowing men to be not really have to take responsibility for committing, there's a lot of this sliding into cohabitation, but you have a kind of you have a suggestion to empower people to make a decision. Because I want to go back and talk about, again, societal breakdown, but I want you to discuss a little bit more on your suggestions in Commit or Quit, because you already you unpacked it for me, and it's really interesting and really good for people to know, because like you said, it seems just so fashionable that everyone just slides into moving their sock drawer over, but that's just not the best way to go about things.
Well, look, we're both Christians, so we're sort of faintly uncomfortable with the idea of cohabiting and sleeping together and all this sort of stuff, because we've been brought up in an environment where these things are sort of something that you shouldn't talk about. But the reality is, people are going to sleep together, they're going to live together. And we have limited control as adults over what our families do and what our friends do. But what we can do is we can talk about when you build your relationship. First of all, go slow. So don't get trapped
Yes.
unnecessarily by moving in too quickly.
Yes.
Because what happens in commitment is that what you want is you want to make your plan and establish yourself as a couple before you start trapping yourself with all the I'm going to use a weird English word, gubbins, which you can laugh about, but all the gubbins, all the accoutrements, all the trappings of
living
life,
together.
which make it harder for you to leave,
Yes.
should you ever wish to do so. And one of the big problems today is that people tend to move in together because they say, oh, it's economically useful. Well, interestingly enough, most of my kids actually tend to live with either their girlfriends or their boyfriends. Sorry, I meant the girls live with the girlfriends and the boys live with their boyfriends,
with other
not their romantic partners.
Roommates.
And so they get all you don't have to have the economic benefits by living with your person you're going to have a sexual relationship with.
There are other ways to do things.
There are other ways of doing things, exactly. So watch out. Don't move in before you've established that you've got some sense of future. So going slow is a really good thing. But this other thing that I kind of came up with, and I've been wrestling with for years, was this idea of drift in relationships. If you've got into a cohabiting relationship, and lots of people do, and actually, frankly, in my country, it's completely the norm now. I mean, I should think 98, 99% of couples who have moved in before they get married. That's a reality, and I suspect it's a pretty high number in the States now. Maybe not quite as ubiquitous, but pretty close. But once you've got to that stage of moving in, and that's the reality of life, then you want to be careful that you don't just end up getting stuck in this relationship you can't get out of. So I came up with this idea of the 2-year rule.
Yeah.
I know it's ridiculous, but I've heard so many stories of people who've been together for 5-6 years and their relationship's been kind of drifting on. You see, once you're living together, it's really difficult to escape. You really got to be very active to make a decision to get out of it. It's very easy to move in together. You can slide into moving in together. It's very difficult to escape from it if it's not working out, if it's sort of only 80% satisfactory. And whereas before, you would just, if it wasn't working out, then you would just say, okay, well, let's drift apart. And you can do that. You can't just drift apart when you're living together. Yeah. It's that much harder. So 2 years, what are you going to, after let's say you've got to 25 and you've been together for or you're over 25 and you've been together 2 years, then you really ought to be in a position where you should either commit or quit. That's my point. Because otherwise you're wasting your life, and particularly for women, where, as they say, the clock's ticking. Yeah. If you want kids, and if you want lots of kids, especially, you're reducing your choices. You need to be getting into a position where you're not wasting your time with useless relationships. And there's a really great example of this, actually. Taylor Swift. I mean, I love Taylor Swift. I don't like her poems are fantastic, I think. I've got 4 young adult daughters. 2 of them are absolutely addicted to Taylor Swift, and she is a global phenomenon. She
absolutely is.
Extraordinary woman. But she had a 6-year relationship with a bloke, and I don't know the ins and outs of their relationship. I have no idea. But when I read the story about it being a 6-year relationship, my first thought was, why didn't they get married? What were they waiting for? How did it take so long to split up? And then I see she's written a song called So Long London. And when you listen to the words of the song, and it's, it might be your thing, it might not be your thing, but in the words of it, she says, I was standing at the altar, waiting for proof. Yeah. I mean, this is slide or decide stuff. And she's speaking to a generation of young women who have been let down by men who don't have to commit. And the 2-year rule empowers women to say, look, after 2 years, come on, sunshine, you've got to do the stuff. Or
pony up with the ring, Daddy.
Yeah, exactly. Put a ring on it. It's Beyonce stuff. If you like it, put a ring on it, or whatever her lines were. He was great about that sort of thing. And it's true. You need to commit or quit. So that was basically my idea. I think the difficulty is, we're in a different game now from what our predecessors were in. Throughout history up until the 1960s, no birth control, everyone got married. That was the way that society organized itself, because it realized you need to bond men to the mothers of their future children, and that's the point of marriage. And we've forgotten that, and we've now got to deal with the consequences of birth control, which has completely changed the game. And I'm not saying birth control is good or bad. I think it's lots of wonderful things about it, but the negative point about it is that it's liberated men from the need to commit, and we need to empower a new generation of young women, the Taylor Swift generation, who are furious that they're not getting the reliable love that they crave.
Yeah.
We need to empower them to be able to say yes and no.
Yeah. And another reason, not just the women, I mean, which is this whole big problem of the age, but as there is not commitment, then the societal breakdown, like you back to the 15-year-olds who almost half of them don't have both parents that they live with. That's kind of one of the reasons that kind of got you interested in this in the first place, was that the breakdown and marriage breakdown, and that kind of going back now to your history. You did work with those couples at the Bristol Community Trust. You taught all sorts of premarital classes, and Let's Stick Together. Maybe we can talk a little bit about your history, and then to your personal history. You have the most lovely letter on Marriage Foundation listed there for a couple that you said to a troubled couple, and it really kind of outlines your history and how your commitment to marriage is what really made you commit to Kate and your marriage when you went through the inevitable difficulties of a young family.
Yes. I mean, sort of without going too much into my background, my parents split when I was 3, which was in the early 60s. So that was unusual then. I was the only kid at primary school whose parents had divorced. That just gives you an idea of how different things were compared to now. And then I was sent to boarding school, which is a peculiarly English way of torturing young children, for 10 years from age 7. I mean, oh my goodness.
Sounds horrible.
That was, yeah, well, there we go. The less said about it, the better. But the result of it was that you learn to be in that kind of environment. I learned to be very independent, but I also learned not to feel as well. And so when I came out of school, I joined the Navy. I flew helicopters, and I was good at that. So I was competent. I was capable. I could do stuff. But I was clueless about relationships and about life. No girlfriends or anything like that. Eventually met Kate. God knows how. I mean, act of God. It has to be. And ultimately, it's turned out that it was an act of God. And that was amazing. But we then got married a couple of years later, because I was quite traditionally socially conservative about these sorts of things. They'll just assume that if you met someone you liked, then you should marry them after a couple of years. So that's what we did. And we had ups and downs during that time. We basically had a lot of fun. We then moved out. I left the Navy and I went into finance. We moved to Asia, and we had our first 2 children in Bangkok and Hong Kong, which sounds very glamorous and exotic. And to some extent it was. But also we were just like any other parents, except we had no social support around us at all. We had no grandparents or cousins or uncles and aunts or anything like that around us. So we very much had to do it all on our own. And we very quickly fell into the classic routine where mum looks after the kids and dad goes to work and earns the bacon, so to speak. And we drifted apart very, very slowly. And it wasn't through lack of interest. I loved my daughters massively, and I was besotted by them. But Kate was automatically so much better at it than I was, because, pregnancy does that. It makes you think for 9 months about your child. Yeah. So she's got a 9-month start. So by the time the babies pop out, then she was thinking about them so much more than I was. It's like I'd unwrapped the Christmas present for the first time. She knew what was inside, and she'd been thinking about it all that time. So we got to a stage where it was, the classic thing of Kate was saying, it's so much easier if I do it myself. But then she was also having to ask me to do things. And of course I said, yes, obviously. Of course, I'd love to do that. That would be fantastic. Would you bath the baby? Yes, whatever. But being very much reactive and on the back foot. And that becomes very irritating when you're micromanaged like that. And Kate's got this wonderful expression that the neglected wife, as she was essentially, because I was neglecting her, the neglected wife micromanages. And it's one of the biggest red flags in early parenthood. And I never saw it, of course, because I thought I was earning the money. And we were doing well. We looked great on the outside, but on the inside, we were just slowly growing apart. And eventually, Kate confronted me with this because it sort of got to a point after our two kids were around. They were 4 and 2, where she just said, this isn't working out. You're not the friend that I want, and if this doesn't work out, we're going to be finished within a year. And I never saw it coming. I had no idea what she was talking about. And I went to counseling, I went to therapy, which opened me up. It dealt with the whole boarding school and stuff, so that I could then express feelings and say, I feel happy and I feel sad and I feel angry for the first time ever, And then I became a Christian, somewhat to my shock and horror, because I was a hardline atheist at that point. They were great things for me, but neither of them did much for our marriage. And it was eventually about 6 months into this process that Kate, in despair, wrote me a letter, which was like a job application or job requirements, job spec for the job of being Harry's wife. And it was, terms and conditions, hours, pay, holiday, all that sort of stuff. But at the end of it, she said, what I really want is a friend. Will I ever get it? Who knows and who cares? And it was those 2 words, who cares, at the bottom of the letter were in capital letters. And it blew me away, completely blew me away. And so I realized, my God, what have I done? What have I done? And I went to Kate, and I got on my knees for the second time. First time was when I proposed. Second time was in this state of despair. And I said, I'm so sorry. You've got no reason to believe that I will change, but I will make this work. And I heard her despair for the first time. And I started to notice her, and I made all sorts of changes. And of course, she was thinking, yeah, this will be a fluff. This will be a gust of wind passing. That Harry will make this short-term change. But I sort of kept at it, and we had some big gains early on. We had big improvements, and also some big shocks, some big crashes, big disagreements, and big misunderstandings. But we started to make it work, and it was wonderful. And ultimately, I guess that's why I do what I do, is because there are so many other Harry and Kates out there who needn't get into that kind of mess. Growing apart is so classic in early parenthood. The vast majority of family breakdown comes from parents who are not talking to each other, not parents who are being violent and abusive, which is foul and should be ended. And I don't think anyone disagrees that those relationships are better off out for all concerned. But the vast majority of family breakdown is so utterly avoidable. And it's those low conflict ones where the kids don't see it coming that are most damaging for children. And that's, I guess, kind of what motivates me. So there's a bit of the being a Christian element about it, is that something I kind of get away from. But also there's this thing that, we came close to the edge and we should never have got there. And so that's basically it.
And then that was what really caused you and Kate moved back to England, and you started your life in a whole different direction of becoming the voice of marriage. You wrote What Mums Want and Dads Need to Know, that kind of explain those things and outline a few recommendations for couples. Do you want to go over some of you had a couple points that were helpful, really kind of common sense, but just helpful and important, because it's a good resource. It's still very valid right today and available for couples, as well as your Let's Stick Together for new parents, which kind of helps them start out before they drift, right? You kind of give them the warning signs.
Yeah. Well, we actually, you'll be glad to know that for an old male writing a book called What Mums Want is Faintly Ridiculous. So it was both of us wrote it together.
Yes.
So it was Kate and me, because it would have just been stupid if it was just me and no one would have read it. But it did quite well because it was both of us, and we did
Yes.
some TV shows and some newspaper stuff and media and interviews and things. So it sold quite well. I mean, essentially, the story of What Mums Want is a little bit about how our story is reflective of a wider experience of so many couples. And I mean, ironically, I've been literally on the phone yesterday to a couple who are struggling, was a guy who's struggling, and they've done exactly this. They've gone through this process of drifting apart. And I talked, I tried to avoid giving him too much advice, because generally when people ask for advice, as you ladies all know, when people ask for advice, they don't really want advice. They just want to be listened to. And I've learnt that in my old age. But I couldn't help a couple of things. And one of the things that I talked about, which was central to this book, was that I think men have lost sight of our role. And we have this tendency, this transition to parenthood is so important. And it's so easy to get stuck into these gender stereotype roles. There's nothing wrong with them. They're natural. That women have babies, and so they're going to be more interested. Women are going to be more interested in home life and children and whatever. They're thinking about it more. But for us blokes, us men, it's something that we have to be more actively intentional about. But what happens is that as the mum's attention shifts from husband or partner to child, then her ability to carry that share of the relationship is diminished, and her focus has shifted to her children so much that the only person in the relationship who can really carry the marriage at that point is the husband, is the father. And I think, in a culture where we're told so much about equality, which is wonderful, we confuse it with being identical. And we're not identical, we're different. And I think the biggest role for men, and I wrote a letter to my son-in-law before he became a father for the first time, and said, look, your biggest role is not to earn money. Your biggest role is not to look after your children. Those are important things, and you should do both of those things. But your biggest role is to love the mother of your child and your children. And that's the biggest thing. And if husbands love your wife, and if you do that, then they're the only ones with capacity to make that relationship work. And I think it's an easy thing to forget, and it's controversial. In fact, I mean, I first got the idea from an American writer called Gary Smalley, you might have come across many years ago. He wrote a book. So he wrote a couple of books on this, and I remember being profoundly influenced by this idea that when things go wrong in a relationship, it's the man's responsibility to sort it out. And it doesn't absolve the woman or the wife from her responsibility, but this is where the buck stops. And I think, let me get Christian here, let me get biblical on this, because I don't often do this, because I mostly talk in secular terms. But Paul talks about husbands love our wife as Jesus loves the church. Jesus loves me, Jesus loves you. So the relationship, that's the power dynamic, but how does Jesus treat his relationship with us? And the key thing about it is that he doesn't make the decisions. He doesn't force us to do anything. He doesn't take leadership over us. What he does do, though, is he takes responsibility, and the buck stops with him. And I really like that idea. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we men can learn, is that once we become parents, our number one thing, and this was the point of What Mums Want and Dads Need to Know, is that mums, we did a survey of 300 mums for the book. It wasn't terribly scientific, but it was interesting. And the things that came down at the bottom of the list were, I want a man who's sort of sexy, handsome, athletic, can fix stuff, can earn money, all those things that we typically assign to men. And they weren't unimportant, but the things that were most important were, I want a man who's kind, I want a man who's a friend, and I want a man who's interested in me and the children. That's responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, and that is a beautiful
Are
picture.
we reveling in this moment?
Yes, and that is a beautiful picture, and too, and that is what all those Swifties out there are singing, that they
That's
want.
what they're craving. They're craving blokes who will actually commit and be kind, be a friend, and be interested.
Yes,
Yeah,
and that is
and it's
whether you're already married, like most of our marriage champions are, or you're talking to those young Swifties. That is it's still that desire of the heart. And marriage, as you point out, is still the best way to get that long-lasting love that you want. Oh, Harry, it's been such a delight to get to talk to you and share your work with our marriage champions. Thank you so
thank
much
you.
for being here.
Thank you. Well, it's a huge pleasure to talk to you in San Antonio. I've got my son-in-law actually works for a company which does a lot of business in Austin, Texas as well. So there's a vague sort of distant connection that I have with your part of the world. I know Austin's just around the corner from you, but
Well, in the
there we go.
winter, when it's not so nice in England and it's very nice here in the early spring, you should tag along with him sometime. We'd love to see you.
I'm on my way. I've bought my ticket already.
And marriage champions, if you'd like any more information about Harry Benson and the UK's Marriage Foundation, you can always find us at marriageinitiative.org and marriageresources.org.